Hi, I'm Pete Swiderski. Today's lesson is about scales. I know everybody hates scales, but scales are very, very important to your musical development. In classical music or in jazz music, it doesn't matter the style. Music is built with scales and is built with chords. If you know your scales, it's like knowing your alphabet. It'd be difficult to be a writer and not know your alphabet. Now, before we get going here, just a reminder to check out my website for a bunch of free information on jazz and on saxophone. Now, practicing scales, it can be burdensome, but first let me point out a couple things important about scales. This is one that I always use with my students. Listen closely to this scale, just a C scale. Now, if I just play this scale descending, does anybody recognize this song? Or you're thinking, well, it's just a scale going down. Now, if I add rhythm to that, listen to it again with different ears. Joy to the world. Now, scales, an important piece of all composers' repertoire. If you don't know scales, you can't improvise. If you don't know chords, you can't improvise. So practicing scales is a must, and really knowing them and having them under your fingers. Let me give you a couple ideas and ways to practice them. First, when you practice scales, one way to always practice them is in fourths. So if I started on, say, C, the next scale to practice in fourths would be F. That time I went to a ninth. It makes for a nice turnaround to the next scale. The reason we practice them in fourths is because that is the natural order that music goes in. For example, if you see a 2-5-1 chord progression, say like you see A minor, a 2-5-1, A minor to D dominant to G major. Now look at those, A, D, G. Those are flowing in the circle of fourths in the direction of a fourth. A, up a fourth from that is D, up a fourth from that is G. You want to practice them in that direction so you can get them in your head and so you can visualize the fourths, fourths, because 2-5-1s always come in fourths. Another way to practice your scales besides the fourths is do them chromatically. Let's say I start on low C again. Then I go up a half step to C sharp. Now do C sharp major. And then D major, up a half step. Etc. through all 12 major scales. Another way that's very important to practice them is full range. A full range scale would work something like this. I start on C. Then I go another octave. Then I go as high as I can in the normal range. That'll take me up to F. Now from F, I'm going to go back down to the low C. And then I'm going to go as low as I can in the normal range. And this will be down to B. And then back up to the C. So the round trip sounds like this. So I've played every available note in the normal range of the saxophone in that key. This makes sure that you don't know just your scales just from C to C in one octave or C to C in 2 octaves, but instead you have the whole normal range. The palm keys and down here low we often neglect because we don't think about playing scales down there. And that limits our soloing abilities, and it also limits our abilities to play more difficult saxophone repertoire because the more difficult stuff often pushes you up to those high notes and down to those low notes. I hope that gives you a couple of ideas to make your scales a little more interesting. One more that I just thought of while I'm standing here is to practice your scales starting on different pitches. So that C major scale, instead of starting it on the root, C, maybe start it on the ninth, D, go down to the C and then back up. Young soloists and jazz solos oftentimes will play a scale, but they'll always start on the root. Now, the root is the most boring pitch that you can pick out of all of the notes on the scale. It's a good solid pitch, but it's also boring. If you get practicing your scale starting on something else, like the ninth, then you could make your scales sound a little more interesting, and then you could feel comfortable with starting in a different place. It'll also help you later on with your modes. Hope that gives you something to think about with scales. Thanks.